Are we ready to go still?
Yeah, do you have something, do you want me to get her just in front of them, or like?
I'm thinking maybe she can kind of walk through and just make things like tell me a couple things about each, and she can sort of point at them and.
I know. Should I put where? I don't know where you want that. I can put this in here. I have other ones too. Collage.
So I just have this one.
Okay. I need my glasses.
Sure.
Some of the things that I think about a lot. I was just focused, not good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just like.
Yeah? Fantastic. Okay.
I'm Ariel Freiberg, and I'm primarily a painter.
My name is Nona Faustine, and I'm a visual artist and photographer.
My name is Lara Ayad. I am a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at Boston University.
I was going to focus on photography, and it turns out that I ended up shifting or spending a good deal of my practice doing performance.
My name is Maria Molteni. I studied, pretty rigorous observational formal oil painting at Boston University, and my practice has taken very different directions.
Part of the reasons why I make art has much to do with me sort of figuring out my own thought process. A lot of it has to do with being diagnosed with ADHD when I was an adult and I was in grad school. Like, oh, this is perfect for how my brain works. I don't need to follow that many directions, which is, again, the key thing for a person who has ADHD. Like, rules and conventions, those are not things that we're interested in. A, because it's boring, but B, I can't remember step by step by step how I did something. I don't even remember how I did this. So for me, it's just like, oh, if I just get to improvise the whole time, and that's basically what live art is, I was like, oh, that's going to totally work. It was also diagnosed around the same period of time with PTSD. And it's how I sort of think about how to integrate myself in a better way that deals with all the parts of who I am. So not just the good parts, but also the kind of shadow self. I remember just talking about a lot of how my family life was as a kid, how chaotic it was, but that pictures and words and making things and working through my imagination was one of the ways that I dealt with a lot of that chaos.
My work generally is facing directly into sexuality and self-censorship and identity. What I've been doing the past about year and a half, I've been taking large gestures to block or self-censor part of the body, and sometimes through that self-censorship, I'm creating more of an expression of what I see is happening beneath the figure, and it's also concealing part of the vulnerable parts of the body. So it's not just, concealing, but it's also expressing like kind of what's beneath the skin. So generally, when we see, it's sort of like fucking up the figure in a way. And usually when we're seeing, maybe like porn or other, other kind of images where we're consuming images of women, particularly, we tend to see images where things are kind of perfected or photoshopped or like smoothed over, or really contained and constricted. So I'm interested also in the power play between that. So by giving you just enough, but then taking that back. I also see the gesture as being my direct hand in the act of painting. So it's not just relying on image, it's also this relationship of the painted mark or the gestural hand or the grandiose, aspect of making a painting, right? There's always this thing where you can swoosh your hands over the surface of the canvas and suddenly change everything or erase everything. So it's sort of accessing agency in my own way through that.
I am writing my research about the fine art collection of the Agricultural Museum in Cairo. And I use it as a sort of a lens, a critical lens, to focus on paintings and sculptures made by graduates from the Fine Arts School in Cairo, all of them Egyptian, most of them male, and the types of paintings and sculptures that they made to show peasants or farmers. And this was a really popular subject in modern Egyptian art. I take a socio-historical approach. So I contextualize them in popular print media, cinema, popular culture, as well as the different political events taking place at the time. And the Agricultural Museum was inaugurated in 1938. So I'm basically looking at artworks that were made during the interwar period between World War I and World War II in the mid to late 1930s.
My work is documentary conceptual based. I'm known relatively for this series called White Shoes, which takes place in New York City. It talks about the 250-year history of slavery in New York, places where the enslaved lived, died, and are buried, and it's and my place in that history as a native New Yorker, coming from the perspective of an African American and my history to photography. In the series White Shoes, it talks about the relationship of the Black body to photography and that early history, the first images that we see African Americans in relation to the beginning of photography. So the first images we see of African Americans at the dawn of photography is enslaved Africans on a plantation in 1850 South Carolina. If you look at the entire series, it's talking about the politicized state of the Black body in relation to photography. It's depicting a body that, in the way that I'm shooting and the relationship to the work and the subject matter is something like that we really hadn't up until this point seen before, like as far as the dark skin plus size fat body in relation to the history and the canon of photography. My other work is portrait based as well. It's called Mitochondria, and it talks about 3 generations of women who live in one household. That's me, my mother, and my daughter, and my sister.
I guess like the work that I tend to be most known for has to do with athletics and craft, and that had a lot to do with my childhood. When I first got up here to go to school, I was like not exactly embarrassed, but I was a little uncomfortable with the fact that I'd had this kind of this childhood as like a jock. Sports isn't by any means the only sort of like concept or theme in my work, but it's part of like a kind of returning to my youth and thinking like, well, who am I? What am I, made up of? Like before I got into an academic setting and was kind of told what artists to look at or how I should be making work, like how did I think about expression and movement and material and all those things. So yeah, I would say I make a lot of work now that's like heavily research based. So there's definitely like pedagogical and educational, social aspects to my work that relate to how I grew up as well.
I can definitely identify at least 3 Black women artists whose work, as soon as I encountered it, I was like, I want to do that. So those 3 women are Deborah Willis, Carrie Mae Weems, and then Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. There was one particular image where it's a triptych, and so Magda's figure is right in the center, and then it's her long, it's her hair, these locks that sort of like go across the 3 images, and it looks like a horizon line to some extent, but it also, for me, that also implied that she was working with not only her own body, but that there were messages that were sort of coming out from the outside and that kind of materialized inside the image. So I remember looking at that image specifically and sort of being just completely like thunderstruck by what that picture meant. When I was growing up, there was no terminology Afro-Latino. There was no Latino. That didn't exist. And I certainly had not come into contact with any Afro-Cuban living artist, certainly not a Black woman living artist, contemporary artist. So for me, that was another sort of clue to realize like, no, this is possible. This is actually possible. With Carrie Mae, I remember in undergrad coming across one of her images, and it was one of a Black woman standing in front of a mirror, and her saying, and something in the text sort of said something like, who's the fairest of them all, and then there's kind of a kind of cruel almost remark that kind of comes back from the mirror in response. I can't remember the name of this piece, but I remember looking at that image and thinking again about how mirrors work, how they kind of tell us about ourselves, but also, are sort of maybe a portal into another realm. So that image really stayed with me. These neat, categories between the Renaissance and between Afrofuturism and conceptual art. To me, there's no, that's not how artists work.
I think that there's this push to only look at art that was made that was made for the court or made for the church. There was art that was being made for religious spaces, ritual spaces, or art that was being made in domestic spaces. So I consider that just as much in terms of addressing, maybe the big bold marks of a Delacroix painting or de Kooning, the Abex guys, and they're they hold court for sure. I remember the first time I saw a de Kooning painting, and I heard something from my mom about, oh yeah, those are really violent images against women. I remember her claiming that. Without even knowing who is de Kooning. I don't know who de Kooning is. I was a high school student, and then seeing them for the first time. But they would never go and pair a body that's so explicitly illusionistic with the gesture. I definitely, even when I was in undergrad, or even speaking with one of my mentors not too long ago, why are you using two different languages? Why can't you just do it in one language? I think that mode of thinking comes out of the Abex constructs of how to make a painting. I come from this place where I was speaking two different languages. I didn't even know I was speaking two different languages. So I think for me, it's more natural to have two different languages discoursing in a painting rather than one overriding language, which was sort of the way that I was taught how to make a painting. My mom's side of the family is Iraqi, but they left Iraq in the 50s and 70s. And so my mom grew up in Israel. And then the rest of the family ended up as refugees in different other places in the world, like Germany and eventually Canada. And then my dad is American. And so, but both are from Jewish background, but from very different kinds of Jewish backgrounds. So because my mom ended up in Israel, they were really focused on the Zionist narrative that they had to assimilate, they had to remove their sort of Arab connection and language that they spoke at home. All of that was to be hidden and concealed and something to be ashamed about. And then also that they were speaking the language of the enemy, even though they were speaking this dialect that was unique to the particular place in Baghdad where they were from. So when I was growing up, I would be speaking Hebrew, but then also this Iraqi language dialect that I didn't know that there was anything different between the two because I was growing up in Texas. So, in terms, those things definitely influenced me because it took me a long time to really directly understand how much that was part of why I was an artist and why I had such a drive to be a maker.
My family's originally Egyptian. I was raised in a family that really appreciated the arts and design. I think growing up in the United States with an Egyptian family, growing up in kind of a culture that was sort of straddling the divide between Western American and Egyptian, and also, being racially ambiguous or being light-skinned and, being read as different races by different people has really shaped not only my motivations in my research, but it's shaped the way I've reacted to the conversations we've been having. When I entered the master's program at BU, I originally wanted to do my graduate work on ancient Egyptian archaeology and Nubian archaeology. And my program was just listen, we don't have the people to supervise your PhD in that particular field, but why don't you do modern Egyptian art? And I thought, oh my God, I know nothing about modern Egyptian art. Like, are there even books about this? Like, I know nothing about the topic. So I did a little bit of digging, and I just sort of accepted that. I entered the PhD program, and there were 2 or 3 books published in English on the entire topic, and I just started loving it. I think there are a couple of main reasons that the art canon has traditionally excluded artists and art educators from outside the West. I think that some critics and some historians, as well as curators for that matter, are invested in maintaining what they call the West, however you want to define that, as the center of artistic creativity, the center of artistic genius, right? When we think of the artist or the genius artist, we think of a sole individual, usually male and most often white, working sort of in their own bubble and just coming up with these really amazing, great ideas. And this type of idea of this very intellectual, genius, creative male artist it persists even till this day in some of the scholarship about modern art in very implicit ways. But I think a lot of scholars, though, are really catching on now to the fact that, look, we can't make this the degendered, deraced standard. I think we have to understand that developments going on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the mid 20th century, in parts of the Middle East, parts of Africa, parts of East Asia, and parts of South America and Central America too, they are developing with all sorts of different complex artistic influences weaving in there. It's not just a matter of artists, appropriating and copying traditions of Western art to make something that's traditional modern. It's not that simple. This idea of local traditional art and Western modern art, those types of binaries, I think don't hold water anymore.
I grew up going to Catholic schools in the South. It was kind of ingrained in Catholic families and Catholic children that you had to be really good at sports to kind of prove yourself. I felt like that was kind of how you gained your social capital or something in the city, was by being really good at sports. And so I was always playing against the daughters of my father's high school classmates, and there were these family dynasties, the Moraleses or the Gonzalez or the Moltenis or whatever, and there was a lot of pressure on it. And I feel like it was interesting. I mean, I appreciate, having that opportunity as a woman to start playing sports at a really young age. I played basketball for 10 years and 6 other sports. And, but it's interesting because it was there was definitely more value put on being tough and kind of you weren't, for example, in school, you weren't popular if you were pretty and rich or something. It was just if you could kick someone's ass, and particularly on the court. I always wanted to be an artist. I would tell people I want to be an artist and a pro basketball player when I was 7 or something. And yeah, I don't know. I was always attracted to all the ephemera of the stuff, and the cheers and the chants and the clapping and the uniforms and the pom-poms and all the stuff, and I kind of always loved bringing some creativity into that.
I mean, my mom comes from, in a way, this generation that was the one that imparted on what it means to be a lady, how a lady carries herself, the ideas that she promotes about who she is. Just the formal stuff, but also this kind of fight too. My mom is a Southerner, and she was part of, this, I guess, last main group of people that came out of the South in the 60s and the 70s. And so that fight, of that era, the civil rights era, so she did pass that on to me. I really appreciate Gloria Steinem when she said that Black women really founded the feminist movement. And it came out of our, out of slavery, being enslaved, and what that does to you. I feel that I'm a feminist, so I don't have any problem with calling myself that. The work is talking about the female body in art history. It's talking about the power in that, reclaiming. It's defying the male gaze. It's my own gaze, because the way I'm looking at the viewer is very, very different from the way you saw women looking in the camera, I don't know, 50 years ago or whatever. So yeah, it's the fact that I'm naked, and the way that I am naked is on my own terms, and so that's a feminist manifesto kind of thing right there. In many ways, it's, even though it's talking about this kind of really sad, this not kind of, this tragic, great American tragedy, it's also a celebration of the female body.
What happens if we think about a project, that's intentionally going after these questions, and how do performance artists work through all of those other conventions related to feminism or Black feminism? In terms of Gray Eagle, that was a really exciting project for me to work on, partly because it allowed me to work with Mary Ellen Strom, who was one of my teachers at the SMFA, and also too because I got to play dress up and make believe, which is always really fun. That's something I've been doing since I was a kid. But what became interesting to me is not just kind of learning a little bit more about Mary Ellen's work in Montana and sort of where her roots are, but also to the history of emancipated African Americans and what that means to the Midwest. Thinking about what would it have been like to be an African American woman who was a frontierswoman, who had to take odd jobs, but also too then ends up opening up like a saloon, or delivering the mail, right? So to me, all of those questions of like, what always for me is always like, what are the women doing? How are they experiencing history, their own lives, their own lived experience? But then also too, what are Black women doing? How are they mapping out their own future for themselves? So an opportunity to sort of, again, play this character and think about what she wore, what she experienced, what she thought about, what her life was like. How art is taught is being framed by a particular power structure or history. Maybe it's one that I can relate to, maybe it's not one that I can relate to. But again, what's missing from that conversation? That always becomes for me a really acute thing. It's always important for me to always be thinking about what are Black women's lived experiences and how I sort of connect that to my own work.
Just the sheer act of doing something that's not under the framework of the market, I think coming from a feminist point of view, is creating a life that's not structured around that market. Being an artist is already resisting that just inherently. Generally, when you pick up when I was a kid, I'd pick up my favorite books. They tended to be more focused on a male character, and usually that was sort of the sort of center of storytelling. Linda Naucklin's essay, why have there been no great women artists, I think is still, I think she wrote that essay in the early 70s, and it's as if it could have been written yesterday. It seems like right now we're sort of precipitous moment where we really need to constantly address it and assess it because of the contentious society we're really in right now, and the fact that we don't have agency over our bodies. What is that? When I was an undergrad and with the privilege of being able to go to a women's institution like Smith College, we were able to have these conversations openly, and I guess a very safe environment for that. And women could dress any way they wanted. They didn't have to think twice about it. They didn't care if they wanted to be addressed with different names or whatever, however they wanted to kind of inhabit that space, they had the freedom to do that. And then I guess the contrast of that to then going to graduate school, which was a very different kind of structure, then suddenly feminism, or that word became really a dangerous word. I think the narrative, so I guess the narrative just hasn't changed. I don't think the issues have changed. To me, it's been a constant. I have not seen it subside. I think that there's more people are talking about it that maybe thought like, oh, I don't need to think about, I don't need to think about being an identified female artist. Why should I even have to think about that? Like I'm just an artist. I mean, sure, that's great. I'm like thumbs up for you for being able to do that. But the nature is that people are not outside of like the little art community. Everybody else is not seeing things in that way. So, we're working with like 4,000 years of culture. We have to keep pressing on it. We have to consistently keep pressing. And it comes back also again to this market structure as well. The logic of the market. And if we're not abiding by the logic of the market, then we have to, we have to keep pressing to make change. Change isn't going to happen dramatically. We get like the backlash. Then if we change dramatically, then suddenly there's going to be a lot of resistance. And that's part of the, the reason why part of why we have what we have right now in terms of Trump and his administration.
I definitely consider my work feminist. I hope that it's feminist. I think it's, I don't want to use the term lightly, not because I have an issue with feminism itself, but I don't want to use it lightly precisely because I take it so seriously, and I really think it's very important as a political tool for giving a voice to women, and for also exposing the sort of gender construct of masculinity. I think a big part of fighting women's oppression, and I think a big part of fighting against the dehumanization of women is to also look at what is driving that. And we do not just degrade women or objectify them for its own sake. We do it for the sake of men. And so in order to understand why images of women may be empowering or may be problematic or whatever you want to call it, we have to put a really critical, singeing lens on men and masculinity. I think that artworks depicting peasants or showing peasants have been a particularly fruitful lens for understanding how artists framed or tried to express the ability of the peasant to become a modern subject and to turn Egypt into a modern nation through the prism of womanhood, masculinity, and race. So all of these things intersect, and not just in terms of talking about depictions of women, but also men as well. So one example is that sometimes some Egyptian artists would depict the Egyptian peasant woman in painting with very light or white skin, because they oftentimes drew a parallel between being modern, the Egyptian peasant woman being reformed and becoming modern by being likened to the local elite. And the local elite in Cairo and in parts of northern Egypt consisted mostly of Europeans who were living in Cairo at the time, or they consisted of people mostly of Turkish descent, and there were many people of Turkish descent in the early 20th century in Egypt because they descended from some of the rulers and the authorities working in the Ottoman dynasty that was in Egypt for many hundreds of years. So there were a lot of relationships that artists drew between skin color and class status, and that class status oftentimes had a lot to do with who could be modern and who couldn't be. Oftentimes when you look at paintings of Egyptian peasant men, by contrast, there doesn't seem to be as much of a focus on sort of whitewashing the male peasant. He comes in different colors, he comes in different browns and blacks, and that's okay, and he can still sort of exude or express this cultural authenticity. Not so with peasant women. I think that's really one good example of the ways in which gender representation intersects with race and class as well in this particular context. Egyptian peasant women often appeared either in sculptural or painting form, and they were a popular subject as well. But more often than not, what you see is them standing in as allegories or symbols of the Egyptian nation itself. So rather than them representing members of a national community, they'll often represent Egypt as an allegory. So a great example is Mahmoud Mukhtar's what's called Nahdat Masr, which means the reawakening of Egypt. And it was made between 1919 and 1928. And it's this massive granite sculpture of a peasant woman who is standing beside a rising sphinx, and she's sort of slowly unveiling, and she's meant to represent the nation of Egypt itself sort of reawakening to her ancient pharaonic heritage or culture that nationalists were really praising at the time. She represents the sort of both the heritage of agriculture in Egypt as well as its implications for the future and building the economy and building the future of the nation. I do see some affinities between the kinds of issues that I tackle in my own research, I'm not looking at the West or America, I'm looking at Egypt, I'm looking at the 1930s, very different cultural context, very different historical context, and yet there are some affinities between some of the issues that we see arising in artistic depictions of peasants from Egypt and some of the contemporary artworks that we see today, especially coming from American artists. I think that in both contexts, artists have really had to grapple with or come to terms with the meaning of the Black body in art, and particularly the meaning of Black women's bodies or their figures, at least, like as subjects. You see a lot of Egyptian depictions, for instance, of Sudanese women and Black African women painted as, villagers in these sort of hutched villages, thatched hut villages from Sudan. You see them sometimes depicted as sort of servants or maids or part of like the sort of working underclasses in Alexandria and other northern Egyptian cities. And images of Black women are very loaded with all sorts of ideas about who's primitive and who's modern, about sexuality. And you see actually the same thing in paintings too of Sudanese men. I mean, I think paintings of Black men, whether you're talking about in the Egyptian context in the early 20th century or today, have just as much to do with sexuality and gender as images of women. And I know that usually when we talk about gender and gender representation, we tend to swap it with women or images of women, but I really disagree with that. I think that men are just as gendered as women are.
There are people that are just like born feminists, which I feel like I would, like I came out of the womb, just ready to kill all the men or something. I feel like at one point it just kind of dawned on me that my hesitation to call myself a feminist and like my sort of potential fear of calling myself a feminist was like, somehow, I've tried to explain this before, but somehow that just made it very clear to me that I should be one. So I kind of started liking this idea that I just like to think about mermaids because they're like these weird kind of freak aliens, like matriarchal, like they don't have a vagina, but they're like sex symbols. And like The Little Mermaid is such a big deal for, I think, our generation, and I was obsessed with The Little Mermaid. But when you grow older, you realize that like she actually trades her voice for a vagina, but they call it legs, and that way she can get the prince. And Ursula delivers a whole speech about how like men don't like women with like who chat a lot, and it's like not valuable to them to use their voice. And so I really like to use that as like a pop cultural reference. There's this scene in Splash, like have y'all seen Splash, where Daryl Hannah, so she's like, Daryl Hannah's a mermaid, and like Tom Hanks has like a boating accident and like goes overboard, and she saves him, and then she like comes to Manhattan to visit him or something. So when she gets out of the water, like her fin turned to legs. But there's a part where, so she like can't speak the whole time because she only speaks like mermaid. And so he's like, he doesn't know where she came from and all this stuff. And she goes missing one day. Like he puts her in like some fancy like people clothes, and she goes missing in the mall. And he's like looking around for her all day, and he finds her in the TV store because they're like selling like televisions. And this is in like the 80s, And she's been like watching TV all day and like learns to speak English. And so he walks in and he's like, oh, and he named her Madison after Madison Avenue. And he's like, Madison, like, I've been looking for you everywhere. And she's like, oh, hello, Alan. He's like, how did you learn to speak English? Like, what is this? And she's like, oh, I learned from the television. And he's like, well, tell me your name. And she's like, well, I can't say it in English. And he's like, tell me in your language. And so she just starts like shrieking. Like she makes this crazy, like, like crazy, like waily shriek noise. And all of the TVs like bust. Like she like explodes the whole store. Those are two, like, I guess, like pre-existing, like pop mermaid sort of narratives that I think are really awesome that kind of, yeah, like present, yeah, this like kind of like absurd, like alien woman that no one understands, you know, and they're just like, what kind of freak are you? That I also kind of think relates to like queerness in a way, and even like being like a sort of femi-queer, especially the more that, we're finally talking about climate change. I'm just kind of thinking about like sirens as like an alarm system. And so how can we think about like matriarchal alarm systems? And there are a lot of like things occurring in nature that you could say are such, like bees, you know, like everybody's getting really alarmist about how the bees are dying. And for the most part, rightfully so. But they're like another matriarchal society that are kind of like giving us these signals, you know, they're like, listen to like Mother Nature, like there's shit going down and you've been like, you've been silencing your mothers, you've been abandoning your mothers, you haven't been listening, and now they're like trying to tell you that shit's going down. So yeah, I wanted to kind of like recontextualize the sirens as these like healers and alarm systems that were like trying to help cure like cultural vertigo, or like the sense that our bodies are not connected to the land and that we don't, you know, that we're completely disoriented. When I started making the tennis paintings, I wasn't, you know, I used to be like a figure painter, and I, for the most part, haven't really been painting very much, and definitely not like figure painting or doing representational painting. But so I wasn't exactly like searching for a way to represent the figure. That wasn't the goal. It was more like, well, I mean, honestly, I just have been really interested in tennis. Aesthetically, I love it. I love that it's about depth perception and precision. Like, I feel like tennis is most related to painting of all the sports, really. Like, I feel like basketball is really related to dance. I mean, they all are, but tennis is so much about that precision and like where the ball lands, and it's so fast and so, so I was just doing some research, and I also love how tennis is this like, it has kind of a Puritan feel to it, you know, because it's so quiet. You know, I guess like historically it has definitely been like a more whitewashed sport. And yeah, I mean, you think, I mean, like it was actually, people were starting to play tennis in monasteries. Like that was kind of where it started. So I think there's always been this kind of like prim and proper reserved history about it, but it also has like a kind of a wild history, because people, I mean, like Caravaggio murdered someone on a tennis court, and, you know, like people would like, it was almost like dueling in some circumstances. But I love the phenomenon of the tennis grunt. Because it's, you know, I mean, they actually changed the rules of the game so that, or they, you know, they made it a rule that you couldn't tennis grunt anymore. And it was only, like, men, of course, had been doing it, because, you know, simply you hit something as hard as you can with all your might, and you, like, let out a big exhale, and sometimes it's like you know. But as soon as women started doing it, and particularly Maria Sharapova, who had, like, a very high-pitched voice, and it has this kind of, like, orgasmic sort of sound to it, I think it really disrupted like their sense of stability almost within the game, and kind of inserted this like feminine sexuality. And so they actually tried to outlaw tennis grunting altogether. Started seeing the line call dispute imagery. So like the Hawkeye imagery follows, it's like a system of 7 cameras that follows the ball around, you know, everywhere it goes on the court. And then when the umpire makes a line call, if the player would like to dispute it, then the cameras like kind of triangulate and simulate an image of how the ball hit the court. And when they show the audience what the result was, like this huge image comes up, like it looks like a painting, except it has this like, you know, squished ball on it because the ball hits the ground so hard that it, you know. So I mean, I was immediately just like, okay, so that's like a Barnett Newman with like a vagina in it, you know, like. And scoring 0 is love. And like we talked about, that came from the word l'œuf, which means egg in French, and an egg is like a 0 shape, so it has those roots. But so I was kind of noticing this egg thing over and over, and how it's kind of like the shape of a vagina, but it's also, I just love the idea that it's like the warped ball, you know, it's like the ball smushing into a different shape, and this idea that like if you hit it hard enough, if you hit it with all your might, you can like change the shape of it, which is like, I think what we're trying to do as feminists, right? Like, you know, we have to hit it with all of our might and show our power times 100, you know, to be able to make some sort of imprint or some sort of change. But then I also like the idea of this thing, this object that has the capacity to be like, I mean, you know, it's a little bit like cheesy and literal, but like to be like a ball or a vagina, you know, and so there's like kind of speaks a bit to like sort of gender dysphoria or gender dynamics and queerness. I just have to also say that a big reason that the Hawkeye technology was developed, which is interesting because it's kind of like a system of surveillance in a lot of ways, but Serena Williams in particular was getting a lot of unfair line calls made against her. And, you know, there's obvious implications of racism there. And so they developed the technology, you know, I think largely because people were advocating for that. And so that's also present too. I mean, I can't speak to the experience of a Black woman, you know, playing tennis, but that is definitely present in the work as well. I'm aware of those connotations in that research as well, and like why some of these systems develop in the first place.
Can you respond briefly to, of course, the past election and what's happening in the White House right now?
It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. The election, I kind of knew he was going to win. I mean, you just, it was like Hillary couldn't say or do anything that would convince people she wasn't the most evil woman on earth. And because he was a man, and because he was a white man, and following a Black president who, towards the end, many white people just resented.
Part of what I think we're all expressing, dealing with, living through right now is the fact that we don't have language for what's happening. And the reason why I say that is because we're still married to this idea of democracy, and we're married to what we think America is, and what the United States is. But what becomes problematic is when those frameworks, those themes, those ideas break down. And right now it seems to me that the conventions of the way that we understand democracy, how we understand the presidency, how do we understand the GOP, how do we understand the Democrats or progressives, that has all been called into question and thrown out completely. Throughout 2016, lots and lots of things went wrong. Me personally and in the world, right? Prince died, you know, David Bowie died, right? So it's just like, oh shit, these are not good harbingers. So if you're a thinker or an artist, you're like, okay, well, where do I fit in this? Because I don't really understand this political context. So for me, the art making process has just been mostly me trying to figure out what this is, right? And the best way that I can think about it right now is a terminology developed by Colin Crouch. He's a British scholar. He describes it as a post-democracy. And what he means by that is that these institutional structures are in place, and they've been in place for a while. They still are there and present, and we're engaging with them. The problem is that they're merely shells. They're shells that are hollow, right? There's not a lot going on inside them. They can be deployed and destroyed and, developed and advanced in a lot of different ways, but they're merely shells at this point, right? And they're constantly being pulled in in different directions by voters, citizens, political officials. So when I started to think about the United States as like a shell of itself, kind of hollowness inside of it, it seems to me it's just like, oh, if it's a shell, that means it can be filled up with things, and both good and bad for as long as we want. But I also think a lot about the death of the American city. What places like Detroit look like, or Flint. It's just like, oh no, this really is a post-democracy, because if the folks in Flint who still don't have clean water, and the government is allowing that to happen, it's like, oh, okay, well, they really don't care about us. This is not a democracy. This is something else.
I'm curious about how, I guess, the female body can also take on national identity, or nationhood, because we tend to refer to a country or a landscape with a gendered nature, right? So she is our great nation, right? We need to care for our great nation, or we love our great nation's beauty. Like, that's one of the aspects that we uphold. And so for me, making paintings that of female bodies, or like psychosexual female bodies, are not just that, but it's also addressing this notion of national identity. So the idea that that's always sort of in flux or in transition.
How do you think that the current political climate and all of the sort of racial and misogynist tension, does that influence your research? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that my very strong emotional reactions to what is going on now in terms of legislation, in terms of cultural conversations that we're having as Americans, whether that's over social media, whether that's through different images and art, for instance. I think it works its way into my research, whether I'm even conscious of it or not. Like, I'm now reflecting on, and I'm thinking, there's a reason I'm passionate about revisiting this topic of nationalism in Egyptian art and the subject of the peasant, which at first you're like a farmer, like, what does a farmer matter? A lot of scholars who have written about modern Egyptian art talk a lot about the national significance of a peasant figure in art. But I want to revisit it in terms of looking at, okay, but like, how are they using race and gender to really shape what kinds of capabilities this figure has to symbolically become modern and to modernize the Egyptian nation? So I think that my, growing up as an American, seeing the different types of political changes that have especially taken place in the past 5 to 10 years, I think that's definitely informed my work. It's important too to remember that intersectionality is not just an issue for Americans, it's also an issue for people outside the West, which, again, I'm really hoping that my work can help to reveal that.
I think the best thing about intersectionality is that we are finally recognizing how complex identity is. And that's kind of what I mean. It's like, you're not just, again, it's a metaphor, but it's like, you're not just like an athlete or an artist, or you're not just like a Black person or a woman, or, it's like it's all much, much more complex. Colors sit like opposite one another because of how they vibrate. And when they're put together, they vibrate in different ways. And it's like, if you have people, if you have like a dominant, like two generally dominant people next to each other, well, one of them is probably going to dominate the other, and one will perform less dominant possibly, or they bump heads, right? I think a lot about the spectrum in general. So like, when we talk about gender identity or queerness, and we think about a spectrum, but you can also think about anything on a spectrum. And I actually like to use like color theory and astrology analogies sometimes to explain this. But it's like, we think of a spectrum and as though it's on a line, right? But really, like, the spectrum, it actually does kind of bend back around and become a circle, because a lot of times things that are at polar opposite ends actually kind of meet back around in a certain way. And like, maybe the best example I have of that was like Bernie Sanders running for president and like Donald Trump running for president, and people thinking that like either of them could take it, because like even though they stood for completely different everything, values and agendas, like people felt like they met back in the middle right here.
Do you think that artists have a specific social responsibility in the face of injustice or?
I think they do. I'm sorry, I just think they do. Yes, you can make whatever kind of art you want, and usually that art is informed by your experience as a human being. So if you never really had to struggle, if you never had to deal with, complex histories of race and class, maybe your work is going to look a lot different. But I think that artists have an incredible responsibility, and I think it's naive to pretend that doesn't exist.
In terms of like the charged aspect, I love painting. I love to paint. I want that love to be, as it sounds cheesy, but I want that love to be there in the paint. I want that to be a direct experience, because I think that's all we have at the end of the day is the hand to the surface. I think inherently the fact that there are bodies that are not adhering to normal behavior, I think makes it inherently political.
In terms of how art, what it offers to the world and what it doesn't. That's a great question. I'm not sure that I have an answer for it. What I can say is that art allows us to use our imaginations, to use our creativity. It allows us to see how artists think. And certainly it mirrors things back to us. Whether or not art can fix us or save us, that I'm not so sure about. I think artists make art because they have to. I think that's about as simple as I can make it for myself. What it does for the world and what it changes, that I don't know. I don't know that now, but I don't know. In 100 years, maybe all that we've done in the now here will make a difference. For now, that's not clear to me, partly because Philando Castile is dead. Sandra Bland is dead. We can't bring them back. There's nothing we can do about it. Walter Scott is dead. Like, none of the things artists have done to respond to these tragedies has changed it. There's still going to be a lot of police officers who are going to get off scot-free. Nothing is going to change. It's certainly not going to get Trump impeached, right? So I'm sort of in this kind of limbo between pessimism and optimism, kind of holding on to hope, putting one foot in front of the other every day, and sort of using the everyday courage of being present and being in the room and trying to figure out what the future is and what the next step is. So for me, art is simply process and research. It's a way for me to figure out how I relate to things. What it does after that, I'm not sure.
I prefer to make political work that invites and encourages people to kind of like think radically. I think true change happens like inside you. And I'm like, okay, I'm an artist. Like my like gift, or this thing that I can offer the world, is to present my values or perspective in like a very special, particular way that can hopefully get inside a person and get them to ask themselves, like, well, how do they feel and what do they do about something?
I think that artists intuitively are these people who are kind of trained in and hone into the world around them and the effects that have on them. And so we reflect back a world. And I think it's very powerful when you can show someone and say, look at this, see this is important. It's about visibility. So artists have, this incredible platform. They can put their work out, several different ways. And so, I mean, my work broke out really on the internet, when Huffington Post wrote this article. And so, I was kind of unprepared for that, but it reached so many people. I mean, it reached so many people. So it was quite, in a way, it was a perfect tool. There's a lot of moments in the history of this country that were in great turmoil. If you're a student of American history, this is not unusual. There have been so many events throughout American history and times and moments that make this nothing. Imagine being in the Revolutionary War, and that whole moment in time, and how it even, let's say you're an enslaved person and you're hearing all this about freedom and wanting your own country and your rights, and you're enslaved, but the insecurity of it, the very insecurity of war and what that brings. Every time in history we go forward, it seems we go back, but in many ways it's for the greater good. So I'm hoping eventually it will make us move on and we can forge something even better out of that.